Welcome everyone to the first International Committee of the PSC this year. And I'd also like to welcome all the others who are coming to this meeting from around the world and also from the DSA International Committee. The subject of today's discussion is the question of multipolarity. And we have very important speakers. Stuart will introduce them in a moment. I want to just kind of briefly introduce multipolarity to you as a concept that has not been implemented at any time in history that I know of, modern history. The idea of multipolarity stems from the work of Marxist scholars such as Samir Amin, including actually Arigi Emanuel and others who believe that the third world and the global south should have its say and its economic level of equality in the world, and that there should not just be centers of power that are in the rich countries of the global north. However, over the last several hundred years, we have not seen any shift that has taken place, except perhaps some element of movement in China over the last 75 years or so. By and large, this event is rooted in the notion that the world is unequal, the whole idea of unequal exchange, unequal development, that the idea of development is not necessarily something that everyone in the world wants to pursue. Development through the neoliberal capitalist lens is essentially a form that actually may mitigate against the interests of the popular masses, the working classes, the peasants and beyond, and rural workers who live and make up the majority of the world. Some 85% of the world live outside of Western Europe, North America, and the rich countries of East Asia. And so, I would envision a multipolar world with centers of power that exist in areas outside of the capitalist center and capitalist core, including South America, including Asia especially, including Africa especially. And in such a way, there would be a greater form of representation that would go way beyond what the United Nations represents. Essentially, in my view, and I guess I'll say something that is rather bald, and that is, I consider it an extension of the multilateral institutions that exist in the world. Essentially does very little beyond what the Wall Street, City of London, etc. Leaders wish. And so we need to shift that to other locations of power through creating power in the global south, and also emboldening the working classes and the peasants, etc., the popular masses, to develop a form of economy that is very different than the kinds that are advanced by the talking heads in Wall Street, Washington, London, etc. So I think my 5 minutes are up. I would like to turn it over to our colleague, Marvin Gonzalez, who was very nice to accept our invitation to co-host this event. Marvin Gonzalez is with the Democratic Socialists of America International Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks PSC International Committee for inviting me to this event. So a little bit about myself. I've been a member of DSA since mid 2016. I served on the DSA International Committee leadership for 2 years, starting in 2020. And I currently serve on DSA's National Political Committee, or the NPC, which is DSA's national leadership. On that body, I serve as the liaison to the International Committee. So currently, the International Committee in DSA is one of DSA's largest national bodies, with about 8 subcommittees and over 700 members. Our work is pretty diverse. It includes various campaigns, lobbying efforts, fundraisers for our global partners, electoral observations. We were in Peru, we were in Venezuela, we're going to Brazil. And along with that, we are very invested in political education writ large, which is why we're really excited to participate in this event. Like DSA, the International Committee has like both a long and a short history. I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go into the short history. But basically, the fulcrum of both centers around the refounding of DSA in 2016, the refounding. So to give a history of that, in 2017, DSA delegates, we have a convention every 2 years. In 2017, at that convention, our delegates from around the country voted to leave the Second International, which we believed had become a moribund and neoliberal institution. And that's kind of the first act of internationalism since DSA was refounded, was to stop being associated with this institution. 2 years later, in 2019, at the DSA National Convention, we passed several internationalism resolutions, one that restructured our international committee to be more of a larger committee, more democratic, and more inclusive of different tendencies. We passed several international resolutions that committed us to positions like support for decolonization in across the world, but specifically the decolonizing the US territories. We also officially signed on to support BDS, and we signed on to support ending the criminal embargo in Cuba. 2 years later, at our 2021 convention, we passed a resolution to apply for formal membership in the Sao Paulo Forum as part of our larger work of trying to do party connector internationalist work. And we've recently have formalized that as that relationship in the last couple of months, and we're excited to be participating in the future at the Sao Paulo Forum. But importantly, we also passed a political platform, the first time we've passed a political platform ever, and it included many things. But in terms of internationalism, it really coalesced DSA's international work around the banner of anti-imperialism, anti-war, and international solidarity. So as anti-imperialists in the imperial core, the broad political objectives that we kind of have started to kind of coalesce around have been to oppose the imperial project of our own nation, support the right to self-determination of all nations, and 3, participate in the construction of socialist alternatives to the world system that is based on cooperation and solidarity. To that end, a multipolar future is one of deep political interest to our committee. Sometimes critics of the IC, of the International Committee, have argued that, and not completely without merit, that our support for multipolarity is a bit naive, as the disintegration of the current world system will just mean a renewed inter-imperialist rivalry, a new era of inter-imperialist rivalry. However, we believe that reducing multipolarity completely to the resurgence of inter-imperialist competition doesn't take into account the discernibly distinct historical moment marked by the rise of post-colonial nations and just alternative poles of accumulation. There's no reason to believe that the ongoing transformation in the world system will simply reproduce the dynamics of the 19th and 20th century, marked by carving out spheres of interest just for European powers. With that in mind, we should both be clear-eyed, but also enthusiastic of the emancipatory potential of not only a multipolar future, but as I believe even some of our panelists today have described, a pluripolar future, a future with a world system that not only has multiple nodes of power, but that those nodes of power are politically distinct from each other. So that being all said, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks again to the PSCIC, and I look very forward to hearing from all of our panelists.
Thank you, Marvin. Ooh, that was wonderful. Really inspiring already. So I'm Stuart Davis, and I'm the secretary of the PSC International Committee, and I'm going to be introducing our two keynote speakers. Actually, before I do that, I also wanted to thank the other members of the PSC IC Steering Committee, Karina Mullen and June Xu, who've been instrumental in getting this event launched, and Samantha Sherry from the PSC staff, who is supporting the event for us today. Without them, we couldn't be doing this. Okay, so Radhika Desai is professor of political science, for those that maybe aren't familiar with her work, hopefully most of you are, and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, as well as the convener of the International Manifesto Group. She's the author of numerous books, including the path-breaking, one that I found just really, really sort of mind-opening for me, Geopolitical Economy, After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, published by Pluto in 2013. Her latest book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy, published by Routledge 2022, will come out in November, and it will be open access. Excellent. Currently, she's working on 3 books: Capitalism's Geopolitical Economy, From Imperialism to Multipolarity, Marx as a Monetary Theorist, and The Making of the Indian Capitalist Class. Our second speaker, Professor Paris Yiros, is a professor at the Federal University of the ABC, or the ABC, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he teaches in the faculties of Economic Sciences, Sciences and Humanities, and World Political Economy. He's co-editor of the groundbreaking journal Agrarian South and a member of the Colectivo Novo Bandung, or the New Bandung Collective. He is co-editor of Reclaiming the Land, The Resurgence of Rural Movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with the late Sam Moyo, and much missed Sam Moyo, published by Zed in 2005, Reclaiming the Nation, The Return of the National Question in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, also published with Professor Moyo, and Reclaiming Africa, Scramble and Resistance in the 21st Century with Sam Moyo and P.J. Jha, published by Springer in 2019. And one more book, apparently just came out. I've not read it yet. Farming and Working Under Contract, Peasants and Workers in Global Agricultural Value Systems, published by Tulika this year. All right, so I guess I will pass it on to Professor Desai and say thank you very, very much for coming, both of you, and for the DSA for participating, and for all the attendees.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. And I just wanted to say that if you like the sort of thing that that Marvin was saying, please do go and check out the International Manifesto Group's manifesto, which is entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, at www.internationalmanifesto.org. It's not a long read and you'll really like it. Okay, what do I want to say about multipolarity? And as Marvin says, what I call pluripolarity, which means it's not just that it's a question of multiple poles of power, but that each is historically a distinct national formation. In my own argument, one of the things in geopolitical economy, and I'll just let you have the link here, I basically started writing this book because I was skeptical about the discourses of globalization. Not because I didn't, well, for a variety of reasons. I think I found that they were exaggerating the extent to which states had suddenly become powerless in the world economy, etc. But eventually I thought I was going to use ideas of US hegemony to criticize the idea of globalization, saying that globalization was really a stage in the management of US hegemony. But the more I looked at hegemony theory, I also realized that that did not hold much water. That while the Americans had tried very hard to emulate the sort of dominance they imagined Britain had in the 19th century, they never succeeded because the circumstances of the 20th century had already made the world very different. So as against these ideologies, globalization, free trade, US hegemony, empire, in which all think of the world economy as a seamless whole in which states don't matter, or only one state matters, namely the United States or previously Britain or whatever. I argue that these are cosmopolitan discourses that serve the interests of imperialism, particularly the effort to, of one country to impose their power on the rest of the world. And that in reality, so neither globalization nor the succession of hegemonies idea really describes the evolution of the world economy. And the way to understand the evolution of the world economy is simply to understand it as the progressive advance of multipolarity or pluripolarity. The reason for that is very simple. The reason is simply that the expansion of capitalism involves not the spread and development of capitalism everywhere to an equal degree, but in fact, because capitalism and imperialism are very closely connected, it involves the subordination of the rest of the world to the imperial core in a variety of different ways that we can discuss. So essentially what capitalism has to offer to bulk of the world is some or the other form of economic subordination. Now, naturally, this is not very welcome, and those countries that, and let's just say countries for now, for simplicity's sake, those countries that can manage to resist, do resist. And so instead of subordination, which involves complementarity in terms of the high value production of the rich economies, complementarity with the high value, so high value production of the rich economies complements the low value production of the poorer economies. So this is what imperialism has to offer the rest of the world. So then those countries that have historically managed to refuse it, what they have aimed at is the similarity of productive structures. And if you think about it, in the early by the mid-19th century, Britain was the dominant industrial power. And even the industrialization of Germany, the United States, Japan, these countries was actually a form of well, it was a form of resistance to British domination, and they were very conscious of it. Writers wrote, American writers wrote things like, "We don't wish to become an agricultural appendage of Britain," etc. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it was a form of what Trotsky would have called combined development, opposing the imperialist uneven development strategies of the imperial core. So this dialectic between uneven development and combined development, or imperialism and anti-imperialism, has shaped the world economy. And it is only by pursuing state-directed protectionist industrialization, in which trade flows, capital flows, investment flows, etc., are all managed to create a more productive economy, etc., which is capable of rivaling other economies. Only then you can have this. That is how productive capacity has spread around the world, not by the spread of markets, not, as Bill Warren so infamously claimed, by the spread of imperialism or anything like that. So it's really what you need to understand the shape of the world today is this dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism. And it's only by resisting the domination of powerful countries have countries managed to industrialize. And so, and because not all countries succeed, of course, and not all succeed to the same extent, but it's because of this that you have seen the spread of productive power and therefore the advance of multipolarity. So that's the broadest argument. Then I add another wrinkle to it, which is that since 1917, it's not just capitalist countries that, sorry, let me just take one step back. If you agree with my argument, the world had already become multipolar by about 1870, because there was no longer just one pole of productive power in the world, but there were now several. Then after 1917, you had essentially with the creation, with the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the attempt to create socialist forms of combined development. And the Soviet Union achieved great success, and China is achieving great success today, rivaling in many ways the industrial power of the core countries. So in that's the sense in which I see multipolarity and pluripolarity expanding. A final note, a couple of final notes I'll make about just the general idea is that the imperial domination of Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the United States attempts at imperial domination have all involved certain forms of finance, which are not particularly amenable to organizing productive economies. So Britain's moment when Britain ran the world gold standard, it was also the moment of its industrial decline. And over the last 50 years or so, we've also seen that American attempts to essentially cushion the dollar with sort of bubbles of financial asset bubbles, etc., have also excoriated the US economy. And so, whereas the rivals have historically been more productively oriented, whether you're talking about Germany or Japan, or you're talking about, or the United States in a previous era, or you're talking about China today. And production necessarily involves considerably lower levels of abstraction than a more financially driven economy. And therefore, what you find is that the reason I favor the term pluripolarity is that the attempt to build successful industrial economies in different parts of the world have necessarily involved a variety of national specificities. So you have very distinct types of capitalisms as well as socialisms. So anyway, that's the broad lot of it. And the another aspect of my argument, which I also would like to connect with what Marvin was saying earlier, when he talked about how, these days people like to dismiss what's going on, the way in which the world, what's unfolding at the world level, by talking about competing imperialisms and so on, and the importance of insisting that what's happening now is very different from what happened earlier. I think this is very important to understand, because the fact of the matter is that the reason why these mistakes are made on the left is that people seem to imagine that Marx, when he talked about capitalism, when he criticized capitalism, he was only doing so from the point of view of the working class. And in my humble opinion, I would argue that Marx actually, and Marx and Engels and many of their followers later on, took the existence of nation states as entities that also were being oppressed by capital very seriously. And part of the theoretical elaboration of geopolitical economy has involved insisting on this. And in my writing, I've also shown that for Marx and Engels, nations are as material a product of capitalism and capitalist dynamics as are classes, and nations are therefore also agents of socialism. And that's partly why our manifesto is entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism. That is to say, you're going to get a variety of forms of resistance to imperialism, some of which may not even be socialist, but they are still important. And of course, the only sure way to challenge imperialism is, in fact, the most successful way is, in fact, to have some form of socialism. So you have also, societies that are explicitly building socialism, but nevertheless, these are all part of the developments that have restricted the ambit of imperialism over the last century and more. And this is another part of my understanding of multipolarity, which is that you are essentially seeing the narrowing of the ambit of imperialism. I don't know how long. How long do I have further?
I think we said 15 minutes, more or less.
Yeah, so how much time do I have left?
A few more minutes.
Okay, so so then I think what I'll do is I'll simply say that part of the reason I argue that that Marxism has been so badly misinterpreted is because from very early on, the encounter between Marxism and neoclassical economics led to a very unexpected result. You would have thought that Marxists would have opposed neoclassical economics very centrally, but in fact they didn't. They followed what Bukharin criticized as a policy of theoretical reconciliation, and the result was to produce, without going into too many details, the result was to produce a what's the word for it? To produce a understanding of Marxism or understanding of Marx's analysis of capitalism, as though Marx was saying that capitalism was more or less contradiction free. And this is, they simply lost the ability to understand Marx's conception of capitalism as being contradictory value production, that it aimed at value production. This was necessarily contradictory in multifarious ways. And this is directly connected to capitalism's desire to be imperialist, capitalism's impulse to be imperialist, capitalism's formative expansionism, which is not there necessarily in countries that are not capitalist, that are socialist. So I think that having said, or having put out some of the main ideas, I'll end here and wait for the questions and answers.
Thank you. Paris, are you ready to go?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the PSC International Committee and the DSA International Committee for putting this event together. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I wish I could be with you there physically, but nonetheless, we can take advantage of this technology and exchange ideas as best we can. I'm also very pleased to be on this dialogue with Radhika, whose work I have followed from a distance, and this being the first time actually we have had this encounter. I hope we can have more of this. I will, I think in 15 minutes, I will just broach some issues and see where the conversation after wants to take them. Yeah, so that's my brief task in 15 minutes. So the first thing, before we get to the terms and what they mean and or what they should mean, there is a historical context which needs to connect with the theory, and that's the long transition from colonial rule, yeah, to a neo-colonial world. Yeah, that's a transition which has marked the 20th century and extends to today. Yeah, and it's a transition which the transition to neo-colonial rule has put imperialism into permanent crisis. That's the one thing that we need to, in my view, put on the table. Be clear that the 500-year system of capitalism never knew a non-colonial world until very recently. And from the moment that decolonization took effect in a generalized manner, the whole system, in fact, could not survive with the profits and the accumulation strategies that it had before. It had to adjust. Of course, it struck back through a financialized form of monopoly capitalism, highly financialized, but that did not resolve its underlying crisis. So we're talking about a crisis that begins in the mid-60s, around 66. The profit margins began to fall in the centers of, in the main center of capitalism, the US. And that was, in fact, the decade that decolonization also made it a definitive advance. So there is a very clear historical connection. Yeah. The other point is that much was made of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In fact, no one really won the Cold War outright. Yeah? This was a three-way rivalry between East, West, and South. And in this rivalry, the sovereignty principle prevailed. Through decolonization, the whole world became part of a generalized regime of national sovereignty. But the Bandung movement was neutralized, the Soviet system collapsed, and the West plunged into permanent crisis. Yeah, so it's not the case that the West came out victorious. It came out very much wounded and unable to lift itself up. So this is the other context which explains the aggression, the imperialist aggression, which has marked even the post-Cold War period. Now, the sovereignty principle, nonetheless, even though it prevailed in this rivalry, it remains fragile, and it is undermined by imperialist aggression, but also by the type of society that has formed in the peripheries, which are societies with particular characteristics, societies where massive labor reserves have emerged. This is the place where the world's labor reserves have become concentrated. And it is marked by disorganized rural exodus, rural urban migration, which creates conditions which are very particular to the South, and which rot from within the affirmation of national sovereignty. They weaken states and societies in the South. So that's before we get to multipolarity, that's the kind of context that we need to be putting all these theories into. Now, the peripheral social formations, I've written quite a bit on this. We in association with colleagues in the network here, the Agrarian South Network. So there is just the data that the International Labor Organization has put out over the years makes it clear that the waged workforce, the proletariat proper, is very much concentrated in the North. 80% of the workforce in the North is fully proletarianized, properly depending on wages. While the same is not the case in the South. There's a variety across the regions, but in South Asia and in Africa, it's as low as 25% of the population depending entirely on wages. So we have a type of population which is not fully proletarianized, and if taken on a global level, we must reach the conclusion that monopoly capitalism in this permanent crisis at the end of its 500 years has not produced a proletariat on a world scale. It has produced partly a proletariat, but mostly a global semi-proletarianized workforce, which straddles town and country, straddles international borders. It involves families spread over great distances, scrambling for incomes, jobs, and a means of social reproduction. That is the type of societies that we have in the South. There's another dimension to this, which is that only 4% of the population in the imperialist centers is located in agriculture, taken together in the North, which makes it a highly urban workforce, whereas it's the mirror image in the South. As much as 65, 69, 70% in some places of the workforce in Africa, South Asia, in the 60s is located in essentially in the rural areas. So the global agrarian question is also very much in the form of a cleavage between North and South. The labor reserves are not only located in the South, preponderantly, but they are also very much a rural population in flux between rural and urban areas. Latin America has its own characteristics. It's much more urban than Africa or South Asia. But nonetheless, even in urban areas, the semi-proletarianized condition prevails. Now, if we take into account, this is anyway the ILO data, if we take into account the amount of own account labor, family labor, and so forth that dominates this type of social formation. Now, what I have called generalized semi-proletarianization is a type of society which needs to be understood as different, which has its own dynamics, its own types of politics, its own type of movements, which are quite different, not entirely, but quite different than movements in the North. A semi-proletarianized population struggles for land, urban and rural land, very intensely, unlike in the north. It is very normal in our type of modernity in Brazil, for example, to have for the biggest movement to be a landless movement, and now we also have large urban landless movement. So this is the type of social formation, which produces specific types of social movements. I can go on and on, but the point is that there are differences, which need to be taken into account when we discuss solidarities, and when we discuss what eventually I'm getting to this, what multipolarity might mean. The one more point before that is that in this phase of permanent crisis, in this phase of late neocolonialism, we have serial socio-political explosions across the South and also in the North. The cleavages and the reorganization of the political pacts, even in the United States, the fights that exist today between the Democrats and the Republicans, and which did not exist to this extent before, have become explosive. There was an attempted coup in the United States a couple years ago. But this is much more. The situation is boiling, has been boiling for a long time in the South, and we have had serial social explosions across the board, in Latin America and in Africa, North Africa, south of the Sahara, the east, south of Asia, all across. This type of situation is characterized by a type of insurrectional politics, which also needs to be understood, in my view. It needs to be understood as a social formation in a particular existential crisis at this stage, which produces all kinds of chaotic explosions, which are social unrest, which is disputed by many forces, but there's no hegemonic force which prevails, and which lead to various, including imperialism, disputes it as well. And in most cases, of course, imperialism prevails in these situations. If we look at North Africa since the Arab Spring, but also in so many other cases, imperialism has gotten fully involved in these social convulsions and steered them in its own interests. Now, coming just to the end of it, when we talk about multipolarity, I think the term itself is it's not. It has Emmanuel mentioned from the beginning that the Marxist tradition has proposed its own view, its own version or versions of what that means. But but it also has a very long tradition in American political science, the realists, and which themselves have varieties. And in their view, it's a type of world in which great powers are in conflict, and they either balance against each other, or one tries to overthrow the others in the different types of formulations. That is certainly not the type of multipolarity that we envision, and I think Radhika made that very clear. We have to think of a multipolarity that leads to something different, and which serves first and foremost this type of social formation to which I just referred. That's the point. We cannot have any type of multipolarity. We cannot have superficial cosmetic types of multipolarity. We need to have a multipolarity which shifts the gravity of the world economy spreads it over various regions in a manner which permits that regions and countries can design and pursue their own alternative development paths. Yeah, this has concrete elements to it in terms of finance, international financial system, in terms of the monetary system, in terms of the flow of investments and trade, and in terms of solidarities, which must exist across the South and between the South and the North. So I think that is the crux of it. That, in fact, one of the great theorists of the world system, Samir Amin, came to use the word multipolarity because we got stuck with it. But he had used the word polycentrism, in fact. Yeah. And by that he meant the creation of many centers of where the law of value, the law of worldwide value would in a sense collapse or be nationalized, regionalized in many places, and also suppressed in the interest of the production of public goods. Yeah? So that's in a sense what he had called delinking, yeah, from the law of value, the worldwide law of value, and that was part and parcel of his notion of polycentrism or multipolarity. Yeah, in a sense, it means effectively establishing conditions for alternative paths of development which serve these societies in the South, and the development requirements. Yeah, that's the point. Now, at this juncture, just to finish, at this juncture, we are definitely in a very dangerous situation. The North keeps going, taking strides towards fascism. This holds for Western Europe and North America, and there's no real light at the end of the tunnel at the moment as to what type of change that can happen, yeah, towards a different direction. China has become the center of gravity in many ways. It dominates trade with most of the third world, and it has shifted the flows of capital and investment and the types of investment, and has itself reached its a certain inflection point. Yeah, it has made a miracle over several decades now, but it has also reached certain limits now in this, given that imperialism has also escalated its drive to dismantle not only Russia, but also China itself. So it is the case now of whether China will make a real left turn, and I think that is the direction it's going, and that will have consequences for the rest of the South. Having said that China has become a center of gravity in so many ways, it doesn't mean that China can say is the savior of the South. Yeah, the South has to save itself. Yeah, and by saving itself, it can also save China. China needs solidarities, and it needs a type of social transformation in other parts of the South, which will guarantee alliances, progressive alliances, looking into the future. So I will end there.
Wait, Karina, are we doing the question and answer now? Right?
Yes, great. Let me pull those up. Well, let me just begin by saying thank you for those really excellent presentations and really enlightening talks that helped to clarify and extend our understanding of the importance of multipolarity or pluripolarity or polycentrism, the different ways of thinking about and framing it. And I think, not just for how we understand and think about challenging US imperialism, but as you both have also discussed, the ways in which global South popular classes, workers and peasants also would benefit from this kind of shift that, in Paris's words, shifting the gravity of the world economy in a way that allows all countries to determine their own development paths. So really enlightening talk, so thank you. Great, so our first question is from Gerard Dalbon. So the question is, after the USSR and Eastern Bloc collapsed, the post-socialist transition to capitalism was devastating for the majority of people. However, here in Eastern Europe and post-Soviet republics today, there isn't really any left-wing movement outside of a few countries, even though many people still think fondly about many aspects of the socialist era and complain about the way things are today. How can a socialist movement develop here and combat the past 30 years of anti-socialist propaganda? And I think that question is for Radhika, but perhaps you both would like to answer.
I'm sure. I'll take a stab at it. I mean, basically, I would say that, first of all, let me just say that the left is on the back foot practically everywhere in the world. And that's as a result of decades of marginalization by neoliberal discourse, of course. But I would also say that, particularly in the case of Eastern Europe, this is a very important element, because in general, it is assumed that Eastern Marxism has been discredited. Then people accept the dominance of various forms of Western Marxism, which are, to me, liable to the sort of misunderstandings that I was talking about, that they do not take into account the necessity of, essentially beginning at the national level, engaging in what I've called combined development, what Samir Amin calls delinking, etc. Obviously, this is not viable for extremely small countries, and there are many quite small countries in Eastern Europe, but in that case, you need to create some kind of broad alliances between countries. But I think that that's, first of all, you have to remove the structures of imperialism. And I think in the case of Eastern Europe, I think that you have to begin by the critique of the present, in which so many countries in Eastern Europe have essentially been turned into labor reserves for Western Europe. And so I think that that whole structure that has to be critiqued. And I think that the legacy of socialism before 1989 has also to be recouped. I'm not suggesting that everything was wonderful about it, but I think there were many wonderful things. And I think that serious socialist scholarships would redeem that experience explicitly. Not at the moment, what happens is that very often the nostalgia for those times is appropriated by the right. And I think this is also extremely dangerous. So that's, to me, that's some element. So basically what I'm trying to say is that all the socialisms we've seen and all the socialisms we're likely to see for a long time have to initially take the form of national resistance to imperial structures. That's how we've got socialism so far. We haven't had, the imperialist core has not been a hive of socialist activity, far from it, because the fact of the matter is that, in fact, here's another thing I should add, the very reduction of Marx's analysis, which focuses on both nation and class and both national and class exploitation, the reduction of that to class alone has actually served to denature Marxism, to dilute Marxism into becoming something of the instrument of relatively privileged working classes. And I think that has to, essentially the predominantly white, relatively privileged, unionized working class of first world countries, and everybody else is forgotten. So I would say that, something like that. And maybe I'll end there, but I'm happy to answer follow-ups as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Paris, did you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. I cannot speak in any detail on the situation of the left in Eastern Europe, except to say that the trajectory over the last 30 years has been a vicious neoliberal assault whose effect everywhere, not just in Eastern Europe, has been to dismantle left movements and create chaos. The Eastern Europe has been integrated in a very uneven, terribly uneven way into Western Europe. Much was promised, nothing was delivered, including the fact that some of these countries have experienced out-migration in a very severe manner, creating all kinds of problems for the pension systems and the systems of the welfare systems in general. So this is a type of situation which we've seen, in fact, in so many other places in the South. Yeah. So that is the I think at some point resistance will obtain, but it will take many forms. Yeah. In fact, it is it's not only an economic integration; it's also a military integration and incorporation into a NATO project. And in fact, the resistance came from Russia in the way it has. So that we need to recognize that you may not want to call it left, or it doesn't have the characteristics of the left, but it is the concrete response to the European and North Atlantic project, which has exploded in Ukraine. Yeah. So that is, so I think we need to be able to put all this into the analysis and not only lament that there isn't this or that. Actually, it is now the turning point. Yeah. And the turning point will have consequences for Western Europe itself. These things are all connected. Yeah. Several governments have already collapsed in Western Europe over the last, in Britain, in Italy, and there is now growing protest in Western European cities against the whole package of military intervention and the consequences in terms of energy and inflation that will create the worst winter in generations in Europe. So this kind of scenario, whatever happens in Eastern Europe will also have, in Western Europe, it will also have consequences for Eastern Europe. Yeah. So it's not the end of history for Eastern Europe. Yeah. So we are now in a very turbulent transition, and all these things need to be taken into consideration when we analyze it.
Great, thanks for that. Our next question is from Glenn Kissack. The question is, in his books, William I. Robinson posits that there is a trans-capitalist class that agrees on two things. One, the neoliberal world order, freedom for capitalist investment and trade, and two, spending unprecedented levels of money and surveillance, facial identification, and the repressive police apparatus. The transnational capitalist class includes the Russian, Chinese, Brazilian, and other capitalists. Do you have a critique of Robinson? Would you like to begin, Radhika? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Bill Robinson isn't the only one who's been arguing this. There are other people who have versions of the same. There's Bill Carroll, Kees van der Pijl, and others have talked about the transnational capitalist class. And I have no doubt that their research is about the linkages through various, groups, whether it's Davos or the Bilderberg group, etc. They're fairly authentic, but I just say that I think that it grossly exaggerates the extent to which there is a transnational capitalist class. It grossly exaggerates the extent to which there is inter-capitalist, inter-imperialist rivalry even today. Just let me give you one or two examples. And I should also add that the fact that Bill Robinson lists, China and Russia as part of the transnational, particularly China, again, it's not very credible. So let me just say a couple of things. Number one, so even in the post-war period, when the existence of the Soviet Union, Eastern European communism, etc., had involved essentially the capitalist countries banding together, there was considerable disagreement on the two sides of the Atlantic about what should be done. And there's considerable evidence of European countries trying to say, no, we want to strike out on our own. For example, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, in which he said, we want to trade with the Soviet Union, which ultimately succeeded because even the United States had to say, all right, we'll all trade with the Soviet Union. And that was the beginning of Dayton. There was a whole episode of France remaining out of the military structures of NATO for a long time, from the 60s to the 2000s or something like that. So there have been such instances. Today in the Ukraine context, for example, not only have European countries, and they are imperialist because they are capitalist as well, but they have been talking about essentially creating the structures of an autonomous European defense and security policy that included having better relations with Russia. So those are a few examples, and that has been undermined in the present context by the Ukraine conflict. Now that brings me to another really important point, which is relevant again to Eastern Europe and to also some of the things that Paris was saying about Brazil and so on. Practically everywhere in the world, the implementation of neoliberal policy over 4 decades, despite its failures, has essentially created also a political breakdown. So in the United States, for example, you find, the Democrats and the Republicans both have difficulty winning elections. None of them has any kind of serious solutions to people's problems. And you see that elsewhere as well. I think Paris was reeling off the numbers of, countries in one or the other sort of political crisis. Now, it is in the context of this crisis that somehow the Americans have managed at least to create the appearance of essentially getting the European consent to their project in Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that this consent seems to involve a considerable self-harm, if not economic suicide, on the part of the European economies. And no wonder, therefore, it's not just that, of course, there are all these demonstrations, and as things begin to hurt at the popular level, there will be such demonstrations. The real question is whether the left will be able to direct them in any meaningful way. There are also important disagreements within the ruling classes, and I'm not sure, but at the same time, as I say, the Scholz government seems to be determined to continue with these policies, but it's going to simply lead to more problems. This will deepen the crisis, and the question is where the left will be, and you will not have a meaningful left unless it is willing to take the notions of nations, national economies, organizing them in a way that is capable of creating a broader based prosperity than the current financialization trends are allowing. And I should also add one other thing, and that is that, the present context, I said that the world was already multipolar from about 1870 onwards, and as is well known, multipolarity at that time definitely involved inter-imperialist competition that culminated in the First World War, a big disaster. And I also believe the First World War is umbilically connected to the Second World War. So I think of it as in the words of Arno Meyer, the historian Arno Meyer, who called it a 30 years crisis, a single long crisis period involving both the crisis of domestic politics and international politics. So but at the same time, the reason that scenario of multipolarity is very different from the scenario today, because precisely the independence of Third World, the destruction of the empires that happened in that 30 years crisis, the independence of countries, their relative stabilization, despite the problems which Paris talked about, which are very real and not to be dismissed, means that imperialism is not able to simply walk around and take whatever territories and, the kind of imperial expansion you saw in the 35 years from 1870 to 1914. You are not going to see that. Even a country as powerful as the United States doesn't seem to be able to create a kind of colonial structure of the sort that will assure the kind of colonial dominance you saw. So we are in a very different place for a variety of reasons. And that's, yeah, so these are all some of, it's a very complex situation. So I'm just trying to name some of the main factors that you have to take into account if you're trying to answer the question whether there's a transnational capitalist class. I really don't think that even among capitalists there is that much to agree about between different countries as we see right now, because they have each national capitalist class is mired in a number of contradictions, which it has to manage. And the continuation of neoliberal policies of the United States. Oh, and I will say one more thing. Sorry, I've gone on for a long time. But if you think about it, today I was just, I was talking with somebody, in fact, it was some kind of it was a radio interview I was doing. And they were asking about NATO. And I said, the fact of the matter is, the old Lord Ismay's statement about the purpose of NATO, which is to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. You think, this was said back in the 1940s or 50s, and you think that this is the Americans have gone back to that idea because the Americans are essentially dictating European policy. The German economy is being destroyed and new wedges are being pushed between Europe and Russia. And Europe and Russia have every reason to cooperate, but they are being prevented from cooperating. I don't see that as a transnational capitalist class. I think there are serious fractures in this formation.
Thank you, Radhika. Paris, did you have anything to add that you'd like to add?
Yes, I think the critique is correct. I can just add just some quick thoughts. There is a certain type of monopoly capitalism that has continued to evolve. Yeah, so it's not exactly what it was 100 years ago. Yeah. And its motive force in terms of accumulation are these big blocks of capital, which still require states for their expansion. Yeah. Now, what Samir Amin had called this a collective imperialism of the triad, yeah, by which it did not mean what Kautsky had meant, the evolution towards a single type of monopoly, but in fact, a type of coalition of states, specifically Western Europe, the US, and Japan, which live off of these huge blocks of capital, and whose big enterprises require open markets for their accumulation needs. About several half a billion consumers for one of these big multinationals, which no single country has. So they kind of have a need for open markets, even while they fight and they compete against each other and call on their states to help them out. So they actually have some kind of until recently consensus. It lasted for many years, for decades in the post-war, and it went through changes over the need to have open markets. Now, this globalization, of course, is coming to an end. As the China factor has advanced, and we are seeing a new type of thinking about offshoring or bringing back companies to nearshoring to the neighborhoods and so forth. So the situation is changing, and there's one other factor, yeah, that and in fact, let me just add that it's China that's defending an open world order, and while when the U.S. is imposing sanctions on everyone, yeah, important point, yeah. So The other factor, of course, is that in this type of collective imperialism, there is a huge asymmetry in military power. And in fact, Germany, basically all of Western Europe and Japan have been occupied by American military personnel. Yeah, they have massive bases on their territories. Yeah, and in fact, they have clauses in their constitutions, Germany and Japan, to prevent the type of imperialist advance in their military posture that there was before. So this is the type of it very much depended on the American hegemony in the strategic field, this collective imperialism. And now it's also, Germany has decided to become the biggest military in Europe. It's been going on a spending spree to renovate and advance its military apparatus. So this is also going in a different direction now. Having said that, now there's another dimension, because I see on the chat box, the Brazilian and the Chinese and other countries and and the rest of the South suddenly is part of it. But we're talking about bourgeoisies that have their own characteristics, and they're not exactly part of the club. Yeah, they want to be many times. They even have huge monopolies that have emerged over the recent decades, but there are a few. Yeah, and they don't have a big state behind them to support them. And in fact, the bourgeoisies in the South have pretty much been absorbed into these value systems, value chains that are dominated by Western monopolies. Yeah? So when we talk about transnational class and so forth, I mean, there is this north-north and the north-south. That there's a different dynamic in each case. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Marvin Gonzalez that I'll ask now. The question is, what are the prospects and difficulties of constructing a 21st century international or international-like organization in the context of multipolarity, pluripolarity, and polycentrism? So Paris, would you like to start with that? Because I know you've written on a new Bandung.
No, I can't say I have the perfect answer, but or a great answer. But the first thing to say is that there's a lot of internationals cropping up. Yeah, so that's one thing. It's not the question is what are the characteristics and qualities and potentials of these internationals? And I can't say that I know them all very well or sufficiently to comment on them, but there is a real vacuum still. Yeah, there's still a vacuum in terms of international solidarity. A real vacuum. It's a real problem. Yeah? In my view, there needs to be most of all a convergence first among the South, the movements in the South, before they can be some reaching out to the North, because the problems are really different, and they cannot be absorbed into some analysis that and the political dynamic that emerges in the North. Yeah? It cannot be simply assumed that the South can fit into the needs of the Western left. So in my view, there has to be a type of Bandung movement, a new Bandung movement, which overcomes the problems of the bourgeois type of politics of the past, but which still maintains a perspective on solidarity, an international solidarity front with forces which are radical nationalists without being socialist, forces which have nationalist credentials, and which have which in any case are under sanctions everywhere. Yeah. So there is much now, in my view, that can be done in terms of moving this in this direction, because there's actually the conditions are quite ripe. Yeah? But the matter of bringing people and organizations together is a different story. Yeah? Now there's a lot of organization that happens in the North, and this will have its role to play. But that's and what kind of links these organizations manage to forge in the South is an open question. Yeah. So I guess I will just leave it there.
Thanks, Paris. And Radhika, I know with your work with the International Manifesto Group, in a way, you're already doing that. So would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess I can make a very brief statement, and hopefully the meaning should be clear. There were two things that one should note about the Second International. Number one, it was, it existed at a time when the world was, there were no socialist countries. So if you're going to try and create a new international, it would have to take cognizance of the fact that there are socialist countries in the world. They are not perfect, but they are a start to building socialism. So how do you create solidarity between the movements, parties, and nations that are fighting for socialism? This is the bullet that has to be bitten by any kind of new international. Otherwise, you are going to create division, misunderstanding, misdirection, etc. So I think any kind of new international would have to take that into account.
Great.
I think that's also, by the way, what Samir Amin would have meant. I mean, when he passed away, I read that manifesto or whatever, that statement that he had created very closely. And I believe that it would roughly correspond to what I'm saying. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is from Peter Ranis. This is for Radhika. What is your view of the recent book by Isabel Weber that the principal influential economists in China today are neoclassical economists, accepting basically the trickle-down theory of capital accumulation?
Yeah, I mean, I should first of all confess that although it's on my reading list, I haven't read Isabel Weber's book, although I've read enough about it to say the following. And also what I'm going to say is actually from my direct experience. I first went to China in 2004, and from about in the 2010s, I've been there very frequently. I would say that from my experience, and probably Zhen Shu might want to add something, I do feel that certainly when I first began going there, I think that there was too much neoclassical economics as I experienced it in Chinese universities. However, in recent years, there has been a very major set of developments. The first is that there is an emphasis on creating institutes of Marxism in various universities. So that has redirected attention back to Marxism, and I think that's a good thing. Secondly, there are a number of accompanying developments have created, more institutes and journals and conferences and so on that are also trying to essentially develop Marxism further, but also in connection with actually existing socialisms more generally, and also, of course, the whole experience of Chinese Marxism, which is a very distinct form of Marxism and very creative form of Marxism. So I would say that there are those two things. And in fact, there's certainly some of us, my partner Alan Freeman and I, we are working very closely with some of these forces, particularly the World Association for Political Economy. And at the last conference, pre-COVID conference that we had, which actually was held here in Winnipeg, there was actually a big discussion which we generated about how this is a problem and how within China itself, we need curriculum reform. So I think that the problem has been recognized and it is being addressed. And if we'd have our druthers, we would address it further. And I would like to say that, I understand, and Paris can perhaps elaborate on this, but I understand that Brazil actually has a very interesting political economics curriculum, which is a political economy curriculum where some form of pluralism is mandatory. So you can't take economics without knowing anything about what Marx said, or let alone, other critical writers said. So you are compulsorily, from what I understand, taught a whole range of approaches, but I think that's just Paris's point to add on and further elaborate on.
Paris?
Yes. As far as Weber's insight into the economics discipline, whatever her insight and her experience might be, it still remains the case that China is not a neoliberal type of economy. Yeah. So even if the economics profession has gone that direction, that line has not prevailed. Yeah. In a number of policies, including monetary policy and the capital account, the financialization of the economy, and so forth. There is in fact, a left turn. I think this is what Radhika is saying, that there is a real plan. Yeah, there's always been a plan in China. Yeah, and which has resulted in the eradication of poverty, absolute poverty, which has resulted in the urbanization of 400 million people in 2 or 3 decades, which the market itself doesn't doesn't do in this way that it happened in China without poverty. Yeah, so it's not a trickle down scenario that we have had in China, and in fact, also the land, agricultural land in the countryside, the principle of land held in common, however frayed it might be, it still remains in place, and that is also not the line of neoclassical economists, for whom, putting value on land and privatizing it is the beginning of the shock therapy. Yeah. Now in Brazil, we it's a fight. Yeah, it's not so to have a plural education, economics. I'm part of an economics department here. It's a fight. It's not handed down. You need to lose friends, in fact, to get it done.
Oh dear.
And
Yeah.
thanks, Paris.
I also would like to hear from Jean, but I just
Yeah.
want to say one thing very quickly, that, I agree totally, of course, with what Paris says. Certainly in terms of economic policy, you don't have trickle-down economics in China. Although, there is a high level of inequality, that's something one can discuss. But anyway, the point I was trying to make, I should have made rather earlier, is that with the prevalence of neoclassical economics of the sort that you saw, certainly in the 2000s, if not the 2010s, led to the concern that you would have, that as these people graduated, what kind of economic policy would they make? So it is important. The curriculum is important. But I agree that China is definitely not some kind of neoliberal economy. But yeah.
Jun, sorry to put you on the spot, but would you like to?
Sure. Yes, I really appreciate the question and also the discussion from Radhika and Paris. I think that for sure, China, as everyone else in the world, has been deeply affected by the spread of neoliberalism. What Radhika described when she first went to China, yes, until this day, I would say 80% of the curriculum in higher education, well, particularly in economics, was dominated by neoliberal writers. That is a given fact. That being said, the other trends that Radhika mentioned were also there. There is an increasing number of school of Marxisms, research centers devoted to Marxisms, and I think the most profound changes are not within the academia. This outside the academia, the social public, because if you look at the 1980s, 90s, the scholars were so fascinated by neoliberal stuff, but the society in general, many workers, they were also fascinated by neoliberalism. They thought this is gonna bring good stuff. They will give us American life. And obviously they have learned the lesson many times in hard ways. And now it's very hard to trick them again. I would say the neoliberal economics, neoclassical economics has largely faded from the general public's ideas, and it's not that respected anymore. And people would be nowadays much more interested in listening to socialist ideas, radical thoughts, anything related to the Chinese socialist practices, Mao's revolution, etc. So it's a totally different kind of ideological environment right now compared to what we had 20 years ago. It changes very fast.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Jun. And great. So our next question is from Greta Berlin. So the question is, the world already has BRICS and Mercosur and even OPEC as economic polars. Are all of you suggesting none of these are effective at making the world multipolar? Radhika.
Okay, I'll quickly say, I wonder if I understand this question correctly, but very quickly, I'll say that BRICS, Mercosur, OPEC, and many other such organizations have already made contributions to making the world multipolar. And new such organizations are emerging. You know, there are particularly successful China-centered ones like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and such like things. Essentially, the imperial decline of the US-led West and its attempts to, or rather, in the context of its imperialist decline, attempts by the US-led West to keep control over the world system are actually being very counterproductive, and we are increasingly moving towards a world where not only are new institutions of international economic governance coming into being, but the ones that are traditionally dominated by Western countries, such as the IMF and the World Bank and the dollar system more generally, are beginning to lose their purchase, lose their ability to control events and trends and so on. So I would say that you can watch this space for further such developments. And I should also say one other quick thing, which is that, you know, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, you saw one big burst of South-South cooperation, out of which many of these institutions emerged. And now we are looking at another such phase. And one can only hope that, you know, it will carry on this work, because there is no other way, actually. For all the millions of people who are in the position that Paris described, there is no other way. Capitalism has nothing to give them but more of the same.
Thanks, Radhika. Paris?
Yeah, the three organizations mentioned here are quite different one from the other. So there are a lot of course, organizations, regional and other organizations that have developed in various ways over the last 40 years. Now, many of them, the ones that have had an economic mission, let's say, were very neoliberal, yeah, in this phase, yeah, which doesn't mean
Paris, we seem to
Hello?
have lost you.
yeah.
Maybe he should turn off his
Yes,
video.
yes.
Turn off his video.
Paris, maybe if you turn off your video for a few seconds, we might be able to hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. But my video is not on, yeah?
No, it's still on,
Ah, okay.
but we can hear you fine. So maybe you can have it back
For
on.
some reason, my computer is acting up. Anyway. Okay, so, all right, let me just try again. So, many of these organizations will evolve, presumably. They have some of these, like in Mercosur, you know, it's the situation in South America has been polarized, yeah, with between right wing governments, far right wing governments, and center left governments. So this has not been fertile terrain for the advance of Mercosur. Now, the real question I think down here would be, the monetary system. If a new currency survives, is actually advances and survives. These are some of the key questions I think beyond the trade issues, which are in themselves are quite problematic, because there's great asymmetries in trade between at least in South America. So these are issues are not are all there are cleavages between in these relations which make difficult a leap. And a convergence, ideological convergence, political convergence is required for a leap to be had. As far as the BRICS, BRICS is another one that has to evolve. Again, there is a kind of structural impulse to it. Big countries in the South, which have their own interests, come together. And the potential for a massive qualitative leap is there. But again, we've had a fascist government here. There's a fascist government in India. And how much can you actually expect, in terms of a leap in this type of organization? It is, at the end of the day, a China-led organization, and China is the one that's taken the initiatives. And if again, on the monetary front, if an advance is made, a qualitative leap, that would really be in the interest of what we have called here multipolarity. The OPEC is, is another complex animal that has its, and that can also evolve in these, and it has been evolving. In fact, the U.S. has not been able to control it the way it has liked to, wanted to. But so that, yes, that is also an organization which will play its part in this transition.
Excellent. Thank you, Paris. Wonderful. The next question is from Jeanette Graulau. This seems to be a question for Professor Desai. Thank you for your talk. The problem is that the anti-imperialist direction that the global South nation states have pursued has entailed the dismantling of all state monetary instruments. There is a dialectics of capitalist industrial production here that deserves scrutiny, because even the progressive left refuses to talk about state control against capital flight. Latifundistas and the bourgeoisie make profits and deposit them in foreign banks. It is shocking that Lula da Silva is not even talking about strengthening the capacity of the state to establish monetary controls to capital flight. Gabriel Boric is not talking about this matter either. So what exactly is the monetary dimension of the anti-imperialist response of nation states today that could be moving them closer to carving a pluripolar world? Thanks again, excellent talk.
Yeah, this is such a central point, and I can, so when I earlier talked about combined development, state-led protectionist industrial development, when I said that this is basically what Samir Amin talks about when he talks about delinking, capital controls are central. And I also agree that capital controls have been undermined in recent years in most parts of the world, although they are not gone. Most developing countries cannot exist without some form of capital controls. So they are still there, but yes. So I would say that's one thing, and just give me 1 second, because but once I finish talking, I'm going to paste in the chat. I'm going to give you a PDF of an article of mine, because what Jeanette is saying about the difference between a financialized form of capitalism and industrial capitalism could not be truer. You cannot have socialism without a solid productive structure, and financialized economies cannot have a solid productive structure. So that's also partly why I have argued in a number of works that countries like Japan and Germany that have had historically more productively oriented industrial structures are probably still in many ways closer to what we need if we are going towards socialism than the US or UK economies, which are your classic paradigmatic example of neoliberal financialized economies. They've got furthest down the road. So I think that they are definitely not capable of creating some kind of socialist economy. So I also agree with Jeanette completely that progressive forces must pay attention to productive structures. And indeed, one of my arguments is that because progressive forces have historically Western Marxism, Western left has historically discounted the importance of imperialism, and therefore they think that that their material well-being or the material well-being of rich countries is because of the dynamism of capitalism and not because of imperialism. And this essentially makes them think that they can discount. Capitalism will solve the problem of production, and all we have to do look after then is the problem of redistribution. Wrong. Capitalism is today in its most countries where capitalism is the most capitalist, is actually suffering from productive failure of production. This is the reason why the most neoliberal financialized economies such as the UK and the US are suffering the worst inflation. Because inflation doesn't come from too much money chasing too few goods, or at least if it does, it's like saying that you have a fever, but why do you have a fever? You have a fever because your productive systems are failing. Your productive structures are failing. So I just wanted to say that this point that Jeanette is making is very important. And as soon as I located the file, I will share it here. Thanks. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Corina.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Great. We'll move on to the next question by Renata Bredenthal. There is a debate within the left about China's mixed economy. What is the likelihood of its freeing itself from the grip of the private capital sector? I read that Xi is trying to strengthen the state sector, but some of the left sees that as equally capitalist in the sense of labor exploitation. Is the outlook simply democratic socialism in China? I'll open that up for whoever would like to answer, including Jun, if that's something you'd like to jump in on as well. Question. Anyone?
Sorry, I was just typing that. Are we answering Renata's question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, I can have a quick go. I think Renata's question is obviously it's very important. And hello, Renata. I guess the way I tend, well, perhaps let me just say this, make this formulation. Okay, so I agree that there are many capitalists in China, and many of these capitalists are very big and very powerful. I also agree that they are members of the Communist Party and therefore, quite influential and so on. However, that does not make China a capitalist country because the reins of political power are not in the hands of the capitalists. And this we have seen time and again. In fact, the Western press is full of criticism of China for calling their capitalists on the carpet and telling them to cease and desist from doing one or the other thing, which is not conducive to the broader interests of the Chinese economy. So I would say that for that reason, I wouldn't say, so China is definitely a mixed economy, and because power is in the hands of a communist party, I would still say that it is a country that is in the process of building socialism in one sense. You may criticize this or that aspect of it, but I think that, using surpluses in order to take completely meaningless flights around the world, space flights is one kind of capitalist consumption. And so I think that the surplus in China is much more directed towards creating a broad-based prosperity than it is in many capitalist countries. We may debate that, but that's my view.
Paris or Jun, would either of you like to add anything? Okay, if not, we could, in the interest of time, maybe I'll also bring in Steve Zeltzer's question, which may intersect a bit with this. Can you talk about the export of Chinese capital, private and public? What are the figures for both? What is the situation of unions and workers and companies, both public and private? Also, do you see an alliance with people and parties such as Bolsonaro and Erdogan who are working with Russia and China? And what should workers do in those countries? Radhika?
Sure. Well, I would say that I certainly don't have the facts and figures at the tip of my fingers. And but I would say that those who are interested should certainly go and look up Deborah Brautigham's SCARI, which is the China Africa Research Initiative. So that's one really useful source of income. In my understanding, I don't think that Chinese capital export is any more adverse to worker welfare, etc. Compared to Western capital export, but that's my broad understanding. I would say in many ways it's even better, but that's more than that. I don't think I can say because I haven't written about this. Is not my research area.
Shun or Paris, would you like to add anything?
I can just on the question of capital export, there is apart from the specifics of the capital labor relationships that may obtain where the capital investment is made, we are talking about substantially different types of investments that are being made by China around the world. The investments in infrastructure, especially in roads, railways, hospitals, and so forth, are entirely different from what the West has been doing over the last half century or more. In fact, so there's not, considering this particular period that we're in, so it is a window of opportunity. Yeah, which did not exist before. Now, I said from the beginning that China is not a savior. Yeah, China can shift the center of gravity, but we cannot expect China to solve all these problems. Yeah, that these countries, the third world in general, has. I mean, that the question before was made about industrial production. China cannot solve this for everyone. Yeah, it solved it for itself. Yeah, there are different types of industrial transitions that can take place. Some can be very adverse. In fact, industrial production can be highly concentrated with a high technology content, which sheds labor, yeah, or it can be a type of industrial transition which absorbs labor. The fact is that the type of industrial transition that the third world has undergone by linking itself into these value systems dominated by the monopolies of the West has created a workforce that's not absorbed into proper employment. So that's the one type of industrial transition that needs to be avoided from here on out. So the question remains, on the one hand, there are major investments made by China in infrastructure, and infrastructure is fundamental to any industrial transition. Yeah, so that's one thing. Now, the rest of it needs some thinking in each region and country, because there is a need for a type of industrialization which is rural based in many cases, which needs to have investment in public utilities, and which will have a different type of trajectory than all the other transitions that we've had in the past. So industrial transition is not of one kind, and we cannot expect China's type of investments to solve everyone's problems. Yeah, that's the question.
Could I also quickly add that, one of the things that we also have to think about is, when when somebody says that, well, capitalist countries are imperialist because for them it's an imperative. They have excess capital, they have excess commodities, they have to push it out somewhere. So there are very different motives in capital export from first world countries, from traditional imperialist countries, and than from China. So an analysis of what these differences are would also be very good.
Excellent, thank you. So given that we only have 15 minutes left, we were thinking that we could just read out the remaining questions and the speakers can then choose which ones to answer, and also, of course, follow up with people afterwards if they like. And let's see, the first one, for Paris, what do you think the implications of global warming are for the agrarian workers in the global South? We also have a question from Nemanja, which I'm going to end with, so I'll hold off on that one for a second. Tony O'Brien, if the imperialist domination of the US/NATO/Japan and their allies were to be reduced by the increased power of, for example, China, Russia, Iran, and others who might ally with that bloc, if that were to occur, is the logic of multipolarity that this would facilitate the return of powerful socialist or communist movements? And then Jack Hammond, most of today's discussion has been from the standpoint of the left or various lefts. Not much has been said about the spread of fascism in some governments and in rising movements in other countries. What is the relationship between multipolarism and the threat of fascism? Nemanja has asked, how do you define an imperialist country? There is a general consensus on the left that core countries are imperialist, but that consensus breaks when we are talking about semi-peripheral countries like China and Russia. These are all excellent questions. And then I just want to add the last question from Nemanja, which I hope you both will answer in your conclusion, because it's such an important one. Since we touched upon the question about the transnational capitalist class, do you see the potential and perspective of transnational anti-imperialist organizing? So I'll leave it to you. Whoever would like to go first. Is that Radhika? Since I see you nodding your head, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll try to be brief. Okay, so I would say that I'll address the question of multipolarity and fascism. So I would say that there are a couple of different elements. So one of them is, that if you think about why is multipolarity occurring at such an accelerated pace, it's definitely related to the historic decline of the West. Why is the West declining historically? Because for the last 40 years or so, it has been implementing neoliberal policies. Why has it been implementing neoliberal policies? Because coming out of the stagnationist 1970s, this was the only set of policies that would have preserved the capitalist character of these economies. So we are all paying the price of preserving the capitalist character of our economies. In this context, for 40 years, the Western working classes have taken a step back. They have suffered stagnant wages, high levels of unemployment, blah, blah, etc., awful working conditions, etc. In this context, the discontents of neoliberalism are vast. The left, however, instead of mobilizing these discontents, has essentially become a version of neoliberalism. So today in most Western countries, you can have conservative neoliberalism, social democratic neoliberalism, etc., etc. But they're all forms of neoliberalism. So the left has neglected the organization of the discontents of neoliberalism. So they are prey, and I'm not saying that working people are en masse voting for Johnson or Trump, but enough of them are to put them in office. And fascism has never been a majoritarian force. It just needs to get close to power. And of course, the other thing is it needs the establishment forces to also open the door to them. And I think the fact that forces like Trump and Johnson have so fundamentally changed the political terrain. Biden is continuing many of Trump's policies. Also tells you that the establishment is becoming open to these things. So this is the way I see the connection between multipolarity and fascism. And of course, the fact that the West is declining can also become an added grievance. Remember, fascism feeds on national grievances. We saw Trump doing that. So I would say that these are some of the connections that I see. Sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. The question about core countries. Yeah, no, that's basically it. I think that's what I would like to think. I think as far as Nemanja's question is concerned, how do you define an imperialist country? I would say that, you know, imperialism in the sense in which we have understood it in Marxism is rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. And a country that is not capitalist does not have the same drive towards imperialism. So to me, maybe 50 years down the road, we may be in a different situation and maybe discussing the other problems. But at the moment, to me, imperialism and capitalism are closely linked. You cannot separate them. So that's partly why I don't feel that China is imperialist. I would say that while countries like, I would be more careful about, say, India, for example, which not only is a capitalist country in many important ways, although not in the same way as Western imperialist countries, but it can have certain imperial impulses. It has certainly tried to lord it around its own little neighborhood, etc. But anyway, we can discuss that and the differences between, say, an imperialism of country like India or Brazil versus the United States, but I would say they are certainly not in the same category.
Great. Thanks, Radhika. Paris.
Yes, there's one question that was directed to me specifically. So the implications of global warming, yeah, for agrarian workers. Well, I spoke of I referred to an existential crisis. So that is part and parcel of the existential crisis to which I had referred. There is a series of social formations in the South which have a social reproduction crisis. And this is not getting any better, and it will only get worse as the labor reserves grow. Yeah, the labor reserves are growing massively. Yeah? And as the climatic conditions also and the environmental conditions also change. So it is now likely, very likely, that there will be a 1.5 degrees Celsius change above pre-industrial levels in a couple of decades. By 2050, there will be, by all means, I gotta know. Yeah, the kids came from school. The climate, the global warming will have devastating. We just saw it in Pakistan just last week. You see the figures, the numbers, and the damage is just unbelievable. That half the agricultural production is gone, displaced people on a mass scale. So that is already happening, yeah, and it's not going to get any better. So the ecosystems, the terrestrial ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, the freshwater ecosystems, all this will be impacted gravely, yeah, exactly in the regions where the labor reserves are growing. Yeah, so this is the real issue that must be. It presents us with an urgency. It's not, we're not talking about a transition that by the end of the century. We need to be able to make a real dent, yeah, in this in a decade or two. This is the real issue at stake. There's a couple of, the question of imperialism. I spoke a bit about the notion of collective imperialism. So that's the basic framework. There's there is a strategic military dimension to it, and there is a financial dimension to it, and a monetary dimension to it. So, and this is what, these are all constitutive elements of the imperialism that has predominated, that has survived to this day, and has to its name, 500 years of European colonial domination. Now, to bring in China suddenly and say that China has all this baggage is incorrect. In the case of Russia as well, it's became very clear how the financial system was very swift in excluding Russia, imposing sanctions, drastic sanctions on the country. So you see that Russia was not exactly participating on equal terms in this collective imperialism, and of course, it was not participating in its military structure. So I think we need to put that into perspective. There was a theory that was very Brazilian some decades ago about what was it called? Sub-imperialism, yeah. But that itself, even though it seems like a seductive theory, it's badly constructed, in fact. And even its author, Rui Marini, in the 90s, before he passed away, was already saying that Brazil had been reconverted, by the structural adjustment, the neoliberal financialization that to which it was subjected. So even if it exists, and I think it was badly constructed as an argument to start with, but it's not a permanent phenomenon. It's very imperialism does not allow it to advance. The big question for them back then was, how far will imperialism allow Brazilian capitalism to advance? Yeah, and at some point, Brazilian capitalism also made a deal with Germany on nuclear weapons, and then so that was really the atomic energy. I'm sorry. So that was really when imperialism really realized that it was reaching its limits. So in the case of China, certainly it has gone way beyond the limits that the U.S. had imposed on China, and there is a Cold War against China. So it's not when the South advances, it doesn't just become imperialist; it becomes subject to an assault, by imperialism. The other question, I think I'll just stop there because we're already reaching the end.
Thank you. I'll pass it to Manny now.
Thank you, Karina, for hosting this discussion. Thank you to Radhika Desai, Professor Desai, as well as to Paris Yaros for coming. I hope to attend your respective conferences in Canada and Zimbabwe. And thank you to the committee that organized this event from the PSC, the steering committee. Thank you again, Karina, Stuart, Davis, and Junju. And thank you, Marvin and DSA International Committee. And we look forward to future events. This is one of many that I'd say a couple, 2 or 3 that we've had over the last year or 2. And we hope to have more in the coming months and throughout this academic year. So look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting and our next webinar as well. And really appreciate our 2 speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.